coming to us. He's coming to us from Denver, Colorado. Please welcome Rob Sherwood, NC0B. Rob, the floor is yours. Thank
All
you for
right.
being.
Well, thank you for the invitation, and see if I can share a screen here. I'll get all you video guys off to another monitor. Okay, very good evening to you. It's 2 hours earlier here, and we're going to be talking about radios, of course. And a lot's changed in 10 years. So if you're looking for a new radio, let's look at some options today. And one thing is the ARRL Clean Signal Initiative. We're going to touch just a little bit on that subject, which we like to see if we can clean up the bands a bit from wider signals than required. And some comments on popular rigs. That's going to be subjective, using them on the air. So what we're going to emphasize today, choosing a new rig is not just by the numbers. It's, well, how's it interface with you? And it's kind of complex. And what do you need for your typical day on the air? If you mainly just rag chew and do FT8, even though you might like it, you don't need a $4,000 rig to have a really good time. It's amazing what you can buy in the $1,000 range today. If you can improve your antenna, consider that job number one. I mean, I realize you may have an HOA. Maybe the family wants the antenna to be invisible, but antenna, here's my list there at the bottom. What's important? Location. Now, most of us won't move, but I did. Antenna next. And if you're contesting or something like that, you're hone your skills, and then the radio model, because there's so many great radios out there. So what's changed in 10 years? Well, the receiver lab numbers that I publish, and of course they're published in QST, are really excellent today. It's just astounding, the leaps forward for receivers. One thing, there's an enormous difference between how you interface with the radio, the user interface, the ergonomics. So I heard we have some new technicians and a new general. So if you're looking at a new rig, hopefully as big as your club is, maybe one of your club member has the rig you're considering, or maybe a couple, and try to sit down in front of a radio if you can. I consider everything today a software-defined radio because everything has an updatable firmware, with an SD card or a thumb drive or something. So that definition, SDR, meant something 10 years ago, I guess, but it's kind of generic today. So there's all these different types of radios as far as the details, but does the architecture matter? Most of the time it doesn't. A superhet that's been around, of course, the superhet term has been around for 50, 60 years. So it's got an intermediate frequency in the 5 megahertz to 10 megahertz range. The hybrid superhet is still just a pure superhet, but it's got a direct sampling band scope, and I'll give some examples. And something that's relatively new, and it's really just Yaesu at the moment, IF sampling. That has an analog to digital converter chip, but it's at the IF, 9 megahertz or whatever, not at the antenna. And then we've got the direct sampling, and that's probably the most popular of the newest rigs. I would think we've got at least 7 that are direct sampling. But a direct sampling radio, by definition, will never have a roofing filter, where the IF sampling can. And then how strong are signals? Well, most of the time, I don't see signals much over 40/9. But if you've got a ham down the street, that's a case where a roofing filter can be helpful. So if you 60, 70, 80/9, that's something that may make the decision for you. So here's some examples. The superhets that are just kind of few and far between now. The TS590SG is still a current product, and that's a regular superhet, as is the ICOM 7100 that you may be using mobile. So as far as the hybrid, I'm considering really the TS890S is the single example of the pure superhet, but with the direct sampling scope. And it's an excellent scope. And I really like the way the waterfall is done on that, for contesting in particular. As far as the IF sampling, as I mentioned, it's really a Yaesu thing, the FTDX 101D or the higher power MP version, and then the FTDX 10, which is around $1,000 radio. Quite a lot of performance there. The direct sampling, that's kind of the current rage, the K4, K4D, 7300, 7610, etc., all the ICOM products, and then all the flex from the previous models to the current ones. And then Yaesu finally did offer a pure direct sampling radio with the FT710, and I'll be talking about that in more detail. So either sampling method has an analog to digital converter chip in the receive path, whether it's sampling the antenna signal or sampling the IF. But only the IF sampling has the option of having a roofing filter. So some tips from contesting. You can learn a lot if you look at a screen capture of the settings for your radio and the band scope. So we'll look at some examples there. One thing that you really should realize is what you're seeing on the band scope is reality. These direct sampling band scopes are just not fooled. And so, for instance, in the past, if a station was flattering and you maybe drop onto a frequency and say, break, your signal is wide, the typical response was, I'm overloading your receiver, there's nothing wrong with my transmitter. You can't get away with that today. The band scope shows what's going on. The other thing that we truly try to emphasize, and we certainly covered that at Contest University, is preamps and attenuators are tools to be used when necessary, but you don't just turn it on and say, well, I'm just going to leave it that way. One attendee several years ago at CTU said, I read in QST that my receiver is most sensitive with preamp 2 on, and I leave it on all the time, even if I'm on like 80 meters. Well, that's just craziness. So I'll talk about that in more detail. So let's look at a couple examples of 10 meter and 60 meter contests. Now, this was a few years ago, 2018. Bottom of the sunspot cycle, the ARRL 10 meter contest. This happened to be a TS890S. You can see the plenty good activity, but signals weren't very strong. So we had 20 stations or more in a 10 kilohertz span. Well, over in the upper right, I had the preamp on. I'm a fairly quiet location, but here, bottom of sunspot cycles, I needed the preamp. And in the lower right-hand corner, the audio peak filter. Personally, I use that to reduce noise, but other people like to narrow the passband and make the audio peak filter narrower than the DSP. So that's just up to how do you want to try it. Try it both ways. I happen to use it just to reduce noise because noise makes me tired. Let's look at the week before, which was the ARRL 160 contest. This is in the afternoon, and this is a 7610. We can see the signals are much stronger. Some of these are halfway or more up the band scope. 50 dB signal to noise ratios for the strong ones. So what's different here on 160? Well, if you look over there on the left, the attenuator's on at 12 dB, preamp's off. 160, 80, even 40, you probably rarely ever need a preamp. Matter of fact, with the 7610 and also the K4, you can pick 15 dB instead of just the 6, 12, and 18 that are more common. So make use of that. Also, the next year in 2019, I didn't have any new radio to evaluate. So I said, let's compare two vastly different radios, the ICOM 7300 and the TS990. Well, to make it fair, because the 7300 only has one attenuator, 20 dB, and the TS990 has 6, 12, and 18, I put the 18 dB attenuator on it. Now, that was more than I'd ever run in a contest. Usually it was 12, occasionally 15. I'd never run 18 before, or 20, and I really liked it. Now, I did have to turn up the volume control, the audio gain a bit, like 3 or 4% of the time. But as I was tuning search and pounce in between stations for hours and hours at a time, the band noise was almost out of the picture. So from my standpoint, the contest fatigue was much less by optimizing the AGC to be not running on band noise. There's no advantage to running a radio on band noise as far as the AGC is concerned. But look here, something that I captured just by fluke. Look at the signal on the left. It says key clicks 5X. Look, it's really strong, but look how wide it is on the band scope. Look how wide it is on the waterfall. That's just terrible. Over on the right, there's a signal I marked clean. It's only 3 dB weaker, but look how massively narrow it is on the waterfall and the band scope. So you really want your signal to look that way, like the one on the right. So if you have a menu on your rig to adjust rise time, pick the slowest number, like 6 or 8 milliseconds. Don't pick something like 1 or 2 that's is just going to make this key clicks like on the left. The other thing that was kind of amazing, if you look again at the 5X key click signal, there's a small weak signal trying to peek through the key clicks. So you can see that on the left. And if you can even see the waterfall having those dots below the weak signal. So that should have been a piece of cake to work that guy if it hadn't been for the key clicks. So let's be a good neighbor. So I mentioned, don't just turn your preamp on and leave it on all the time. What we want to measure, you can do it by ear, but you can measure to make a measurement too, of course. Antenna noise gain. What does that mean? Well, that's going to apply in the upper bands. And really, if you've got a dummy load, and everybody should have a dummy load of some type, even if you have to buy an extra antenna switch like an Alpha Delta or something, make the dummy load something you can easily access by turning a switch. And then as you go and just turn up the volume so that you can hear noise coming out of the receiver, that's going to be receiver noise. And then you switch to your antenna. Let's say you're on 15 meters. Well, if the band noise doesn't come up significantly, then you need your preamp. But if whatever preamp setting you have or no preamp and the band noise comes up plenty, then there's no need to turn the preamp on. Matter of fact, one relatively recent 10-meter contest, I didn't even use the preamp about 90% of the time. The band was just wide open. Now in the lower bands, you don't want the AGC running on noise, as I mentioned. So either you can use an attenuator, an RF gain, like in the 7300, but then the Flex has a slider called AGCT, standing for AGC threshold. So you can adjust that. And the Apache has a horizontal line on the display. You can move that up or down. So really, when we're on 40 meters, 80 meters, and 160, running some attenuation or adjusting your AGC threshold does not hurt sensitivity. You're not going to lose the signal because 160 meters at night has a band noise about 30 dB worse than 10 meters during the day. Well, all the rigs, of course, are plenty sensitive on 10 and now 6. So we've got too much sensitivity on the low band. So that's where to optimize the dynamic range of the radio, make use of the preamp when you need it on the high bands and make use of your attenuator on the low bands when appropriate. Well, you saw what a CW signal that was wide looked like. So let's look at sideband. And of course, we all know about sideband splatter. We can't possibly have been on the air on HF without hearing some splattering signals. But what's available today from two different companies, Apache and ICOM, is a way to linearize our exciter and possibly the amplifier. So if we look at this waterfall, this signal on the top of the waterfall, that happens to be a 9-year-old Apache 200D running pre-distortion that's called Pure Signal, written by Warren Pratt. And he was also driving a solid state amp that was in the correction loop. So look, his signal is just a rectangle up and down. And on the right-hand side, just the tiniest little indication of a splatter every once in a while. But you can see a spur, probably from a switching power supply or a wall wart or something that's sort of wobbling around on the high side of his signal, clearly standing out. But down below, well, that was me with a Kenwood TS990S and an Alpha 89, a good station, of course, but there without pre-distortion. Look how wide I am. Your signal without pre-distortion is about 3 times as wide as you'd really like it to be. So now in my case, I was a little bit stronger, but still all those splatter sidebands, as long as you have enough signal to noise ratio. Now, if your band noise is S7 and you're working somebody S9, you can't see all this detail. But these signals were happened to be on 75 meters, as you can see, and the signals were like 20 or 30 over 9. So here's the one that I'm happier with. In this case, the signal on the top of the waterfall is me with a 7610 running ICOM's digital pre-distortion, but I'm driving an ACOM 1000. The 1000 is not in the correction loop, but because it's a tube amp, it's so much cleaner that look how clean my signal is. Just it's very similar to what the Apache was with pure signal. So we now have two major companies that are offering this feature. Down below, instead of it being me with the Kenwood, I've got a Flex 6600M driving a Power Genius. That's their top end amplifier. But look, he's like 3 times as wide as this ICOM signal with the pre-distortion. So this is what's the future can bring if we can get more OEMs to support it. The pre-distortion is the answer to splatter. Well, if you've been to my website, there's 150 plus radios on there going clear back to the 70s. And here's the top 25 models. Now there's duplicates because like the K3 came out in 2008 and the K3S or the direct sampling radios, there's more variation from one individual sample to another radio that's the same model. So I don't have duplicates in here. So this is the top 25 models. 20 years ago, we couldn't buy a 100 dB radio. And now look, that's right in the middle. But we were actually, thank goodness, don't need a 100 dB radio all the time. I'm out in the country and probably never see the radio in an overload condition. But look at this range from 110 to 87, and you can enjoy DXing, contesting, rag chewing with all of these. I've had the good fortune to operate 20 of these 25 models in major contests over the last 20 or 22 years. So this is just the sample, the options you have to pick a radio are just all over there, are tremendous today. There's my lab, by the way, where I have fun testing these radios that end up on my website. So how do you select a new radio? Well, I'd say pick one of the 25. Sit down in front of it and see if it works for you. That'd be a good start. However, let's say you've been running one brand for 20 years and you want to stay with that. All of the top 6 OEMs, original equipment manufacturers, have a good model. So you can stay with whatever you liked in the past or change brands, whatever. Just pick one that fits your budget. The price range today is really a lot of radio for $1,000 to ones that are more than $10,000. So the choices are all over the map. But as I emphasize, the user interface, the ergonomics are very different. So what I might be happy with, you might not, or vice versa. So try one out before you spend your money, if this is possible from your club, or go to DX Engineering or wherever. One thing that most of us live in an urban environment. I'm in Denver right now, but my main station's out in the country. So noise is an issue, as you probably know. So noise blanking and noise reduction is something that you may really want to play with. Current rig offerings. Now, with the 6 major OEMs, they'll often have some feature that they're emphasizing to differentiate from everybody else. So we'll look at that. And then I'll have subjective comments on running these radios in contests in the last few years. So we'll see what that's like. And mostly CW, I'd consider a CW contest more of an acid test for a radio because on sideband, particularly since the bulk are not running pre-distortion, that the splatter is more of a problem. So the CW contest really kind of shows how well a radio performs. Now this is my operating position 1 of 3 at my QTH out in Weld County. And normally, if I just had one new radio to compare for a contest evaluation, I put it at contest station position number 2. But in this case, we had the FTDX10 and the FT710 that I ran for 3 months. And so here's how I set that up. There was the FTDX10 at operating position 1. And this was the 4th quarter of 2022 for contesting and general operation. And then over on the right was operating position number 2 with the FT710. It's kind of lost under the big monitor there. Again, that was the 4th quarter of 2022. There happens to be my antenna farm. It's not like Tim's, but pretty happy with it. Everything's a monoband beam, and I've got 9 HF Yagis and then VHF UHF 2. So that's out here on the Pawnee Grasslands, Colorado. So let's look at some individual models. Flex has been busy with military contracts. Of course, they started with a military contract to develop the 6700, and then they've continued to have contracts for newer developments. So I would say in the last 5 years, Flex is focused on remote. There hasn't been a lot of change in their DSP programming for features or noise reduction or something like that. Recently, in the last approximately a year, the 8000 series has replaced the 6000 series. Until there's new software from Flex, however, the 8000 really won't do anything different than the 6000. And even though they've talked about pre-distortion now for a very long time, it still hasn't shipped yet. So we're hoping Flex may be the next one to have pre-distortion. The Maestro C is the 3rd iteration of their remote console, we'll call it. So you could be in your front porch, I guess, and be on the air, or at a hotel or something like that. 8000 shipments are kind of constrained. They seem to be sort of dribbling out, but you can't order the 4 models online. One thing I find annoying is there's no schematics or service manual. Now, admittedly, with service mount, you may not want to fix it, but I like to be able to look at the schematic, look at the block diagram, or if I have some minor problem, diagnose it. So no schematics, unfortunately. Comment on the Apache G2. That's the most recent model from Apache that replaced the 7000. Warren Pratt's written some really good noise mitigation, noise blanking, noise reduction. It's I would say it's probably the best out there. Apache is one of the 2 between ICOM and Apache that has pre-distortion. Of course, Apache's had it for like 12 years, and ICOM's had it since November of 2023. I would consider the Apache radios a fiddler's delight. It's not plug and play. And if you just got your general and want an HF transceiver, I'd say pick a standalone 100-watt radio, not QRP, and not one that needs a computer to run it, as your start. What you do down the road, up to you, but you don't want to have a stumbling block when you're just going to get on HF for the first time. The Apache doesn't have really good documentation on all sorts of things in menus that I don't even know what they do. A company makes the radio, and all the software is open source. You're probably familiar with that term. So that's volunteers that write all the software, including Warren, who writes all the DSP code, including the pure signal. Make a comment on this really popular 7300. I'll call it a game changer 8 years ago, not because it was the absolute best radio, but it was the first direct sampling radio that had knobs instead of running it with a computer and a mouse and all that. ICOM sold over 100,000. You can't get on the air or have 2 or 3 QSOs and not run into a 7300. It's got good dynamic range. It operates much like the more expensive 7610. I happen to really like the ergonomics and the scope. It has a common user interface pretty much across the line from the 7300, the 7610, the 9700, that's a VHF, UHF, and their QRP 705. They added a scrolling feature a few years ago that works across all the transceivers that makes search and pounce very handy to do with the band scope. So very happy with that improvement. The software is very stable. Bugs are not a problem. It does not have an audio peak filter. That's the only thing that's really missing from the 7300. But you've got DSP, you can narrow it down 100 hertz, for instance. Comments on the FT710. Now, this is Yaesu's first direct sampling transceiver. It's got a clever design that no one else has done yet besides them. It's got dual ADCs, not because it has two receivers, it does not, but it uses two ADCs, possibly in quadrature. They don't tell us how they're doing it. And the dynamic range is 3 or 4 dB higher than the typical direct sampling radio. The radio is probably fits against the 7300, but it came out 7 years later, so the lab numbers are better. You'd hope so after 7 years of the 7300 center run in the world. So we've got the pricing range there around $1,000 for the two 710s, one with a speaker, one without, and in comparison to the popular 7300. So during this time period there, fourth quarter of 2022, I did CQ Worldwide CW, ARRL 160 CW, and 10 meter CW and sideband, because that's a mixed mode if you wish. The FTDX10 has just numbers just a hair below the 101D. The ergonomics are vastly different from the 710. It is an IF sampling superhet like the 101D and the 101MP. Both the 710 and the 10 do have an audio peak filter. So the contests I ran were ARRL 160, 10 meters, plus the Stewberry contest there with the 10. So sitting down in front of the 10 and the 710, it's almost like they were designed by two different companies. You can adjust the filter bandwidth quite easily on the 10 with the knobs, but it's not very handy with the 710. The 10 has the volume control on the left side, which is kind of near the VFO, so you have to be careful not to bump the VFO. On the 710, which came out later, it's on the right-hand side. The 710 has the less crowded buttons because some of them are on the upper top front edge of the radio. So there are some on the front and some on the top. The band scopes do not recenter like the Kenwood does or the ICOM does. So that's kind of annoying to me as a search and pounce CW operator. Well, I heard about Parks on the Air, and of course Summit's on the air. If you're interested in that, either QRP at 5 watts, or if you bring an extra battery, which I'd recommend for going to be up on a hill for a long time, 10 watts with this ICOM 705. This is a really cute radio, and it works 160 through 70 centimeters, sideband, CW, FM, digital FT8 with a laptop, of course, and its price is not bad, $13.50. It does have a companion tuner that works really well. It's kind of a battery-operated latching relay version of the ICOM AH4 and the newer 730, I believe it is. So if you have a 23-foot piece of wire you got up in a tree and a radio on the ground, you can hop bands from 40 meters to 6 meters, touch of a button with the tuner. I did work a 705 New Year's Day of 2023 on a mountaintop 100 miles away. He had an S9 signal, 2 meter sideband, a little 3-element beam that was on a tripod or something. Tremendous signal. So it was just fun to hear one on the air. It was just booming in like he was in the shack. There's what it looks like, 2.4 pounds. By comparison, the 7300 is a little under 10 pounds. So just a few comments on the 705. HF, it's pretty much like a 7300. Has VHF features, some of which I use, some of which I didn't, like D-Star. The ergonomics are like all the 3 other models. But the display does recenter. So if you're working, like a 10 kilohertz swath, tune up to the next 10 kilohertz, it recenters itself. And so that I found great. The contest, I ran the 705, ARRL 160 CW, and the 10 meter, both sideband and CW in 2020. This has been announced. You may be familiar with it. Haven't seen one yet. The Yaesu FTX M-1F, kind of a funny moniker there. Not shipping, maybe it will at Hamvention, don't know. It's obviously going to try to compete with the 705. It says it can work HF and VHF simultaneously, so maybe you could monitor your 2-meter repeater and be working stations on 15 meters. It does replace the 817 and the 818, which are now gone. Runs either 5 or 6 watts with the internal battery, or with an external battery can run 10 watts like the 705. Don't know the price. It does have an optional tuner like the 705 that's not built in. Oddly, it has an optional cooling fan for, I guess, for FT8. If you're only running 5 or 10 watts, I'm surprised you need a cooling fan, but I guess it does. The K4. Well, that was a long wait, of course. It was announced like 5 years ago. Major firmware improvements in the last 2.5 years. They have a lot of beta releases. So if you like playing with beta releases, you'll love it. Personally, I don't like beta releases, so I wait if there's an update till it's a release, and then you can just wait till each release. Of course, as soon as you have a new gold release, there'll be a new beta on the next stuff. So that's your choice whether to play in the beta world. Last year at Hamvention, they did have a way to have one K4 talk to another K4 for remote. Kind of an expensive solution since you needed 2. Most people buy the K4D, which is dual receiver. So it's almost $7,000 with the tuner. So if you had 2 of them, wow, $14,000 solution. In the meantime, they're working on some other stuff. At Hamcation in February, I was there, and Eric talked about the Superhead HD model that he had a prototype at the booth. I didn't see the prototype. They're still working on transverters. He did bring a K40, which of course, if you're a K3 guy, you probably knew what a K30 was. So that's going to be about a $2,000 remote head that has all the knobs on it, but no RF, that would just talk across the internet. So that was shown at Hamcation. Still no general coverage timeline and still no pre-distortion. I'm going to guess that Flex will have pre-distortion before Elecraft, but who knows? As with Flex, no schematics and no service manual. They are taking pre-orders for the K40, by the way. I get phone calls and emails all the time. How do you compare the 7610 to the 7300? So here are how I compare them. There are no noisy relays in the 7610. The TR switching is solid state. You can key your linear with a FET, or you can key it with a relay, but I always use the FET. It does have an audio peak filter, of course. It has 2 identical receivers. Now, anytime there's a de-expedition, like Galapagos, I'm going to want to use the second receiver. It's very handy to look, well, where should I call the next time I have a chance, or find the hole or whatever. You know, for more typical operating, I don't use the second receiver, but de-expeditions, absolutely. It has more buttons and a larger screen. It has buttons for each band, 2 transmit ports, 1 receive port. I do now finally have a beverage. You can hook up a great big monitor on a DVI. I don't. I just like the built-in monitors fine, but other people like great big screens, and more power to them. The quieter fan is nice. You do have a lot more fun with the second receiver if you buy the remote control knob, the RC28, to control the second receiver. Now it's kind of pricey, but Flex and Elecraft's external knobs are the same price. So as I mentioned, the pre-distortion came out Thanksgiving Day, 2023. With 1.40, now they're up to 1.42 that fixed some other things besides pre-distortion with the I and Q. And that's 1.42 has been out quite some time now. Again, though, if you're mostly running sideband RAGCHU and FT8, be happy with your 7300, but the 7610 is really nice. 7760, relatively new this year. I've just had the chance to evaluate it. It's taken like 6 weeks. thanks to Tim. And it's a 200-watt rig. There aren't too many of those. The MP, of course, is a 200-watt rig. At 990, that's, I think, we're in effect out of production, but it's still around. The used market, and maybe someone's got it in stock. It's up, edging up towards $9,000. So the 7760, 6,000, 7610 is 3250. So the received specs are the same. 7760 received specs and the measurements in my lab are the same as the 7610. But it's got, of course, a 200-watt power supply that's built in. It runs on 65 volts. The remote head, I mean, it's always 2 units. You got a 35-pound RF box and a 5-pound control head that looks like 7610 more or less. And you can hook them up with Ethernet up to 100 meters, 300 plus feet. But some new software came out a few months after it was announced that this control head can now work across the internet as long as you have an access point. And matter of fact, you can have more than one control head, and I'll mention that in a moment. So the 7760 with digital pre-distortion is really excellent. It's cleaner than the 7610 by about 8 dB, but that's probably because the PA is 65 volt with a 450 watt chip or pair of chips. The additional control heads. So let's say you don't want to tear down your shack when you're on a business trip, you're going on vacation, you want to operate remotely. You can buy a second control head or more. Up to 5 will connect to the and sort of register with the 7760. It's going to be about the same price as the K40. The pre-distortion barefoot works really well, and I'm running tube amps, alpha and ACOM, so I don't really need to worry about putting the amp in the control in the correction loop. But the only amp right now that works with the 7760 or the 7610 is the PW2, which is a very clean combination, probably the cleanest on the market. Once we've got the pre-distortion. And why would you ever turn it off? So things to consider if you're going to be getting a new rig and what to do. Check out the ergonomics. Be sure it works for you. Is the speech processing adequate? For instance, the K4, when it shipped, it didn't work. Of course it works now. Do you want to run your computer, have your computer run your radio, or just standalone? I'm a standalone guy. That's just who I am. License is 1961. Is the firmware updated regularly? I mean, everything's updatable, but if there's no new updates, well, like there's usually bugs or features that could come along, like pre-distortion came along out of the blue for the icon. Warranty service. I'll mention that because Kenwood had a really good service center in Virginia. For some reason, it got shut down. It was contract, and everybody was sent stuff to California, and they were terrible. Well, they got fired eventually. And so there's a really good company in New York that's doing the Kenwood service. So we really do need factory service. And what about parts? I say the most thing to worry about is there are about 10,000 K3 owners, and parts are pretty tough to get. But there's so many out there on the used market that if you really did need a part, you could buy a parts unit. Bottom line, do you enjoy using your radio? Is it fun or is it a struggle? If it's a struggle, consider something else. If it's just works like a dream, be happy. If you want a PDF, I'll send the PDF to your club, or you can send an email to rob@nc0b.com, ask a question, want a copy of the PDF. It's all available. Let me drop out of this, quit sharing my screen, and see if you guys have any questions. Is everybody there?
Yes, we are here, Rob, and thank you for that excellent presentation. Does anybody have any questions? Corey's got the mic and can run around for this. This is the guy. If you're making any sort of a decision on a radio, whether it's used or new, this is the guy. He's been to the mountain. He is the mountain.
Well, it certainly was a tremendous opportunity to operate the top out of that top 25 that run contests with 20 of them. How many people get to do that?
It's just an excellent presentation. And one of the things that really stands out is that I think you've turned over every rock when it comes to radios, but maybe there's any questions here from the audience on anything that you saw here that Rob talked about this evening. Or maybe you have a radio that isn't on the list.
There aren't too many.
But I know you'll be out at Hamvention. And of course, if you think of a question between now and Hamvention, you can always email Rob. And Corey, you're going to make this recording available too off the website. Yep. I mean, maybe it's just me, but this is like trying to drink from a fire hose, right?
That's true. And if you take 3 or 4 things home from tonight, consider that's great, because there was it is sort of a fire hose.
Dave, go ahead. Dave's got a question for you.
You talked about the radios. What about the power supplies?
Well, I happen to use linear supplies. Not that anything wrong with a switcher, but I happen to use Astron 35Ms, and I like metering in case something is a little flaky. So that's an option, of course, but I have used Astron switchers in a portable situation, and I had some birdies because the antenna was like 20 feet away. So I'm very happy with the support from Astron. I've had 1 or 2 damaged by a nearby lightning strike, and I just bought a replacement board for $20 or something, and it was back in the service.
Like big transformers.
Yeah, they are, and they're heavy, but I don't know. You're never going to get a birdie out of a linear supply.
Thanks, Dave. Anybody else have a question for Rob Sherwood? Ron's got a question here. Stand by, Rob.
The 7300, there is some accessories I've seen up on Amazon available that get installed in the back of the radio. Are you familiar with those?
Well, there's some that let you have an RX port, so that may be useful. Is that besides that, do you have something else to mention?
Yeah, I think that's what it was. So what all can that do for me if I put it in radio?
Well, you're not going to do diversity or anything like that, but I have a loop antenna and a beverage. Now, my QTH in the country is quiet enough that I don't find them really a big improvement, but other people do. So I do have the RX port on the receive only port on the 7610. So that's where my loop or my beverage goes. So you can do that with the kit, and it's a pretty nice, well-designed addition. You don't have to drill holes in the radio. So if you do have, a pixel loop or something like that you want to play with, and you do have a 7300, it's probably worth $100 or whatever it costs to get that kit.
One other thing I did do to my radio is I first thought I was actually a technician, and of course didn't really use it on the HF or anything yet. But what I did buy was a 2-meter/70 centimeter transmitter for it, made in Ukraine, specifically made for the 7300. I found that pretty useful. Basically allows you to operate on the 10-meter band, acting as 2-meter or 70 centimeter.
Well, I hope that the technicians in your club do remember that you've got some privileges on 10 meter sideband that you hopefully make use of to kind of get yourself rared up to get on HF and get that general.
Oh yeah, I understand that. I just didn't have the antennas at the time for it and all that. And I was really in the 2-meter at the time, and it does give you 12-watt output, which is nice.
All right. Does anybody else have a question for Rob? All right, well,
Does anyone in the club have a 43-foot vertical that you may have gotten from DX Engineering, for example?
any 43 footers out there? No, nobody here's got one of them, Rob. But there's
Okay.
always hope.
Well, I want to say that let's say you had a 7300 or 7610. The ICOM auto tuner should be out there at the base of a 43-foot vertical. That's the best way to do it. I know that you can use the ununs and all that stuff, but I'm a believer for a vertical. The tuner is right at the base, and you have ground screen or radials. Have an article on ground screens. If anybody's interested in that, just drop me an email, because I work 160 and 630 meters with it at Marconi T, and having a tuner right out there at the base is the way to go. So just something to think about if you're uh, looking at a vertical and maybe you don't have a lot of space in the backyard. So, but put the tuner in the right place.
Rob, while we have you here, why don't you tell everybody about your professional background in broadcasting? What did you do professionally in broadcasting out there in Colorado?
Well, I got out of college in 1969, and there was kind of a hiring freeze at Hewlett Packard where I had applied. So I got my first job at KOA, 50 kilowatt station on 850. And I worked there for 18 years. And as time went by, I took over taking care of the transmitters. So we had two 50 kilowatt transmitters. Then I started taking care of the 100 kilowatt FM station up on the mountains. So I did that and then I did actually work for a PBS station when I left KOA. So I did commercial broadcasting for about 25 years. And then I went into IT. So I started my consulting company in IT and did that for 33 years. So it was enjoyable working in the broadcast field. It was more lucrative from the standpoint of salary back then than it is now. So I was glad I made the transition, but it's kind of fun to be able to work on 50 kilowatt transmitters.
Well, Rob, we certainly look forward to seeing you at Hamvention. We want to make sure you travel safe. And thank you so much for presenting this evening. Let's give a round.